as always, like it's a pleasure to talk to you about anything that is happening in city politics, especially because you are like deep in it. And I have to begin by saying AOC's blurb on your book basically is a testament to this, right? Like I forget what exactly is the language, but it says something to the effect of the sharpest mind in local politics or something like that. So first of all, yeah, how's that been? Like how's the reception to the book, the pre-orders, and like the praise been? If you can begin with
Yeah,
that.
it's been really good. The book is due out June 22nd, so pretty soon. Definitely excitement. We're waiting for more reviews, but so far those who've seen it, they really liked it. Kirkus gave it a really generous and enthusiastic review, which was great. And several publications I know are in the process of reviewing it, and I'm sure there'll be more. And I think the reception is going to be good. We're having a real in-person book launch party on June 24th,
Mm-hmm.
and in Brooklyn. And I think that is going to generate some excitement since people just have not been to book parties in a while. It's going to be at a great outdoor space. And so I'm really excited about that. And overall reception's been good, and I'm just really looking forward to more people reading it and getting it, especially when it comes out officially.
Hey, I want to come back to the book probably by the end of this conversation, but before that, I wanted to get to the basically the happenings of the day, which is that like the mayoral election is like basically a week, around about a week away, and the way the election campaigning has been reminiscent of the crowded 2020 Democratic primary or the Republican 2016 primary, in which like support eventually coalesced around an establishment and change candidate. Of course, those two are not ranked choice voting. So, what's the status of this mayoral race, and how much does RCV change the game here, you think?
It definitely does change the game, and the truth is we don't have a great handle on what's going to happen right now. Eric Adams, who's the Brooklyn Borough president, appears to be the polling leader, and he's building a coalition of Black voters and moderate whites that could prevail on election day. But you've got at least three other candidates who are very much in the mix. Andrew Yang, of course, who has lost his dominant polling lead, but still very much is viable and has not collapsed, and will still be getting a lot of votes. Maya Wiley, who is Bill de Blasio's counsel, has benefited tremendously from the implosion of the Diane Morales campaign, who had been exciting progressives until she had a lot of problems with her own staffers. Just felt like they were mistreated and then quit and are now trying to form a union. And then Scott Stringer, who's accused of sexual assault by a woman who says she was assaulted 20 years ago. Stringer denies it, but it's an allegation that it has hurt his ability to grow his coalition. So Maya Wiley now, with the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez endorsement, is the most viable progressive left of center candidate. And then there's also Catherine Garcia, who is de Blasio sanitation commissioner, who is running as a technocratic moderate, but who's also appealing to liberal white voters who used to like Scott Stringer, and is someone who has risen, seems like chiefly because she's endorsed by the New York Times and has been very appealing to a certain type of like left liberal, highly educated voter.
The reason I made the comparison is the sort of fluctuations that you're pointing out in popularity and support each candidate seems to have had among rises and falls, such as like Eric Adams and Maya Wiley rising and Stringer and Morales like falling, and Yang kind of more or less some sort of maintaining support. I don't know how much exactly it is. And again, how much of these trends are actually reflected in the on ground coalitions, and what do the on ground coalitions look like for each of the candidates? If through that you can maybe like expand a little bit on the coalitions that are existent
Sure.
in New York politics itself, like in New York City politics.
Sure. So I'd say in comparison to 2016, it is a different dynamic. At the 2016 Republican primary, you had a candidate in Donald Trump who really despite the media's disbelief, was dominating in the polls for most of the race. He had a lead and he kept the lead. Here, it's much more in flux. The electorate is very big and very diverse. So New York City, it's a city of 8 million people, a few million are registered Democrats. Turnout is expected to be around 800,000 Democrats. It's a closed primary, so only Democrats can vote. And that's a huge number. 800,000 people is more than in a lot of states. And it's a bigger electorate than, an electorate you would see in certain statewide contests. So when you think of like a New York City mayoral race, it's better to not so much imagine it as a municipal contest, but think about it more as a highly diverse statewide like race. So you have a lot of different types of voters and a lot of different types of coalitions. You have a large, Black contingent, sort of moderate, working class, middle class Black voters. You have a large and very diverse Latino vote. And within that Latino vote, there's a lot of different factions that really trace themselves to, the home country or territory that the voter came from. So you have a Puerto Rican vote, you have a Dominican vote, Colombian, Ecuadorian, and so on and so forth. So a very diverse Latino electorate. You've got a large Asian electorate that is also not a monolith. You have a very big Chinese population. You have a growing Korean population. You have a Taiwanese population, and they are, traditionally not voted in high numbers. But with Andrew Yang, who's Asian American on the ballot, he's hoping to grow that turnout. You have your large progressive contingent from gentrifying neighborhoods. You have older white liberal voters. You have young leftists, the multiracial young type of coalition that's highly educated, that helped power the various socialist victories in New York City. There's a big Orthodox Jewish vote. So you can just see that there's a lot of complexity. There are a lot of heterodox voters who don't necessarily follow the neat rules or guidelines laid out by the pundits. And so it's a race that definitely, given that it's a primary and given the amount of people who are going to vote, there's not a great deal of clarity about what's going to happen. I think we can make guesses, but ultimately all the top candidates have not been very far apart in the polls. And with ranked choice voting, you can rank up to 5 candidates. That can certainly change the calculus, and we won't know the outcome until July because of the way New York counts its absentee ballots.
I want to kind of have a very brief follow-up to that, if you will. Like, I kind of want to understand ranked choice voting itself as a concept, and like, if you were to explain this in a kind of almost like a sports broadcaster kind of way, what sort of scenario do you see happening with the leading contenders? Like, if you can give me a couple of instances of what sort of toss-ups could happen based on the percentages of votes that the candidates receive.
Well, it's hard to say. So with ranked choice voting, you can pick up to 5 candidates, and how it works is, on election day, you get out results, based on the first place votes that the various candidates received. And then an automatic process is undertaken where the lowest tallying candidates are eliminated, and then their ballots are distributed upward to the next candidates based on how their first place voters also voted. So, having a ballot with 5 candidates, really gives you the best chance to affect the outcome of the race. And basically, candidates keep getting eliminated in rounds, and this is an automated process based on the number of first place votes they got. So eventually, you'll have it down to 2 candidates, and then 1 candidate will hit 50% and be declared the winner. You technically don't have to hit 50% if all of, the ballots are exhausted, which is the term that is used. If you've counted all the ballots and maybe some people left ballots blank or left people blank, a winner is declared, but the idea is to get to 50%. So how is it going to go? Hard to say. You've seen a lot of polls where the top two ranked choice vote getters are Eric Adams and Andrew Yang. There have been some polls that have shown Maya Wiley creeping pretty high and Catherine Garcia getting a lot higher towards that top two. But, your goal is to find a path to victory, beating another candidate in that top two. And the question is who can do that. Right now, Adams and Yang look like they have a path deep into RCV, but I think Garcia and Wiley also, given their rise and their popularity with, with the large contingent of educated, left of center voters, they're also going to be there and be viable as well.
Okay, so I've seen comparisons. I can't say where I've seen the comparisons. Off the top of my head, I'm not able to remember exactly, but I've seen comparisons of Stringer's the campaign, falling due to the misconduct allegations, to Alex Morse's campaign, especially since it happened to the left candidate, the candidate around whom the left seemed to be coalescing in a state where the governor, ostensibly heads a right-wing Democrat machine. That too, when the governor himself is under investigation for, those of his own. How do you think that has to do with the events surrounding Stringer's fall, like the simultaneity of Cuomo's and Stringer's, misconduct controversies happening seem to like it. I wondered what sort of dynamics exist between the two.
Well, there's no way yet to prove that these allegations were cooked up by Cuomo or by a nefarious political machine looking to take down Scott Stringer, in the way that it became clear that the Democratic Party in Massachusetts was behind the Alex Morse allegations. I do think there's a similarity in that neither the Morse allegations nor the Stringer allegations were substantiated in any great way. You had an allegation in Stringer, and Stringer now has two allegations. There's a second one by a woman who alleged that Stringer groped her in the early 1990s when he ran a bar. And, in both of these cases, the allegations happened a very long time ago, and there isn't much evidence to undergird them. It doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just means there's not a ton of evidence there. And that really makes it difficult to really know what happened. But what you've seen with a lot of progressives is they're not really willing to wait for evidence. Once there's an allegation, they pull their support. This is what happened to Morse. It happened to Stringer. And quite frankly, and I've written this, I don't think that is a good way for the left to operate going forward, because bad faith actors could concoct allegations against popular or rising progressive candidates, and they will know that these progressive organizations and politicians will immediately withdraw support. Whereas conservatives who have a lot of problems will not pull away immediately if there's an allegation like that. But what we've seen is that the left is willing to do it. So the question is, if you really have no bar for any kind of hard evidence that's produced, what's to stop a conservative political operative from inventing allegations and staging events, or creating a scenario where a progressive candidate is entrapped in some way, or just creating lies out of thin air, and knowing that once the allegation is made, support is withdrawn. So I do think this is something the left has to think about seriously going forward. How these allegations are handled is something that is going to be a question for some time, because this won't be the last time you see an Alex Morse or a Scott Stringer get accused of something.
ultimately, new polls seem to be showing Eric Adams in the lead as the sort of sleeper Biden-esque establishment figure, and the field seems split among sort of insurgents. Is this similar to the 2020 Dem presidential primary? But the 2016 Republican primary was kind of the opposite. Am I oversimplifying, or is this like the future of Democratic primaries itself, where there's always going to be one establishment figure and one person, or like the field scattered among change candidates?
I wouldn't make a sweeping proclamation based on this mayoral race. I do think each race is its own entity. There really were not any strong progressive or change candidates in this primary to begin with. I mean, that's one of the issues in that, the socialist bench in New York has gotten very big, but it's still quite young. So none of the new DSA elected officials are in a position to run for mayor of New York City, which requires being in the political firmament for a long time and being able to raise millions of dollars, and it requires also being very well known, like Andrew Yang. So you start there, that there really was never a great left candidate. You had Scott Stringer, who had been a career Democratic insider, who in the last few years, a little bit like Ed Markey, had repackaged himself to appeal to the young left. You had Maya Wiley, who now is the progressive candidate of choice, who had worked as in the Bill de Blasio administration and had been, had a middling tenure as the head of the Civilian Complaint Review Board, which investigates police misconduct and also defended de Blasio, and she was his lawyer over, corruption allegations and, hid information from the public and from journalists. And then Dianne Morales was this third candidate who really had no involvement in left movements at all and had founded a charter school, who really slipped into the space and was able to rise based on her charisma and commitment to defunding the police. But she imploded when her staff turned on her over a lack of pay and bad working conditions. That was the state of play. There's no Bernie Sanders or even Zephyr Teachout, who ran against Andrew Cuomo and is a pretty compelling figure. There was no one like that. So it was really picking amongst the lesser evils for a lot of left voters.
Let's get real. Is any of these candidates offering a program for governance? There's really no way of knowing from the coverage, because even in legacy papers, the coverage seems insubstantial and barely rises above the level of like tabloid journalism. When the election was national, a list of leftist podcasts, like basically when they covered the policy agendas and gave a clear picture of whom to trust, as you're pointing out, Bernie Sanders type figure, we kind of had an understanding of that through like the campaign financing and stuff like that. Now we get to know bits and pieces through your appearances, for example, on like Crystal Ball's program or Bad Faith or Jacobin, etc. Can you take the time to lay out what you think each candidate's leadership could look like in your leftist perspective? What to expect from any of them in terms of governance?
Right. It depends on the candidate, right? I think from a Catherine Garcia, you will get, very much a non-left government that in some ways may expand the social safety net, but in other ways may lean toward privatization, will support charter schools, will not be friendly toward the tenant movement, and will be very pro-developer. I think Eric Adams and Andrew Yang similarly will be much more supportive of the real estate industry, and in some sense be more moderate, certainly in their approaches to policing and their approach to education, where all three of them, Garcia, Adams, and Yang, are supportive of charter schools. I've always said with Yang, he is potentially less detrimental for the left because he's more persuadable. He's running on a few big ideas that do have progressive origins. One is a public bank to help those who are unbanked, which is a big problem. And another is a cash transfer program, which, if it does not eat into the existing social safety net, is a nice idea. And the question is, how do you implement that? So I think there are a lot of concerns about Yang that are very real, because he's very enthralled with public-private partnerships and the privatization of government. And, Eric Adams certainly is not a candidate of the left either. And then with Maya Wiley, could be, maybe an improvement on the de Blasio administration, which had a few big progressive achievements, one being universal pre-K and another being the right to counsel for tenants who are facing eviction, which was a big deal. And there's a good chance the next mayor will exist to the right of de Blasio, after 8 years of a lot of people on the left being very critical of de Blasio, rightfully so, for tacking to the center on policing and on other issues. It potentially the next mayor, if it's Adams or Yang, could be much more dismissive of progressive movements, whereas de Blasio always had a sympathy for them and certainly didn't interfere in them. I could see an Eric Adams trying to tamp down DSA, tamp down left activists and movements in a way, de Blasio never did. And Maya Wiley certainly wouldn't. So, there are a lot of unanswered questions though. Like you said, the coverage has not been great, and it is not nearly as comprehensive as it used to be, mostly because you've seen a real decline in the in the ability of newspapers to pay reporters and keep them on staff. All the major news organizations outside of the New York Times have faced severe economic challenges, and the New York Times doesn't cover New York City like it used to. It's become an international and national focused paper, and more of a vehicle to appeal to kind of a liberal nationalized subscriber base. But it doesn't do as much metro reporting as it once did. And sadly, the other news organizations who are trying very hard don't have the degree of people power that they used to have because of these struggles of the news industry and the fall in advertising revenue. And we are dealing with a diminished media environment, which is unfortunate, though there are still a lot of good publications and good places that do important work. It does seem with each mayoral cycle, there's just less of that quantity of coverage that you would like to see. Because when you get quantity, you will get a mix of coverage of substance and a coverage that lacks substance, but it's always better to have a lot of something than not a lot of something.
Right, that's actually pretty. That's a good way to put it. I want to talk about Yang specifically because from first seeing him, I've had my own personal journey with him. From first seeing him as a rogue anti-establishment candidate with a wild idea, I've kind of had trouble placing him on the solidarity spectrum, if you will. This election, especially, and his willingness to, play ball with a lot of standard Democrat, like political operatives. I don't even know Democrat or Republican political operatives on the campaign. Kind of made me wonder if he's just like more of like a self-made Pete Buttigieg type of figure. So in the city that's basically reinvigorated social democrat consciousness, Yang seems to be like kind of recognized as a consultant type of candidate who doesn't get the support of labor organizations, DSA, other grassroots outfits. How much has Yang tried to court this left? Has he had any success? Does he ultimately care? Because he's portrayed to have pretty, a boilerplate lifestyle brand type of campaign.
Yang has not successfully courted the left. I don't know how hard he tried. It's possible, the influence of his consultants, particularly Bradley Tusk, who was Bloomberg's top consultant and is very involved in the tech world, that had a real role in pushing Yang away from embracing the young ascendant left movements in New York City. Yang has definitely run more of a scattershot campaign where there are some left ideas, but then there's a real emphasis on quality of life, on more aggressive policing, on public safety, on this idea of privatizing or reimagining government. So, it's definitely been really a mix between, some left impulses, but then more reactionary forces. And he's built an ideologically diverse coalition. There are some really progressive legislators supporting him, like Ron Kim, who's known for standing up to Cuomo. And then there are Orthodox Jewish leaders who would agree with Kim on nothing, who are also backing Yang. So he's definitely forged an unlikely coalition. He's not running as a left candidate by any means. I think he should have done more to court the left, or at least to head off criticism that he's faced, because, the New York City Democratic electorate does have a lot of people who are left of center, or at least left liberals, who are supporters of Warren or even Buttigieg. And those kinds of people look skeptically at Yang because he has not evinced expertise like he should. He's made a lot of gaffes. He's often seemed unprepared and lacking in detail, and really not wonky. And I really expected Yang to be more wonky when he first announced. That had always been kind of the image he cultivated as a presidential candidate. He has not really leaned into in-depth policy and wonkiness on his campaign. I do think, had he really come into it sounding more prepared and, being willing to impress these very educated voters, he could be in a better position than he is now.
Right. One of the breaking news stories in recent times I remember seeing is how much corporate firms such as BlackRock, if I'm not getting the name wrong, are purchasing homes outbidding ordinary people. New York City has been at the forefront of organizing against the corporatization of landlordship. You yourself have been part of actions and so on. Democrat politicians do have connections to such corporate landlords in New York City. How do the candidates in the mayoral race fare beyond, this game show questions that they've been getting on housing valuations and so on?
The question is, how do they fare on,
in terms of their with respect to the news story of corporate landlords, outbidding buying property in mass, and this has been happening in New York City as well, I would imagine, to a sizable extent. And
it's a good question. There's been very little discussion of it, to be honest with you. I think Adams, Yang, and Garcia have all been fairly supportive of the real estate industry. Adams has taken a lot of donations from, corporate landlords. You have wealthy real estate industry interests supporting super PACs in favor of Yang and Adams. And Garcia is someone who's been, not really a pro-tenant candidate, but there really has not been a lot of discussion about this, and there should be, but there hasn't been. And so I can't say one candidate has articulated a better policy vision or platform than the other here, because this particular issue has not been covered to any great degree.
What are some, as a sort of brief follow-up, what are some issues that are really important to New York politics, especially to organizing at the grassroots level, that you see not being, as we discussed, coverage has been pretty spotty, and it's been at the tabloid level as far as I have seen, at least. What sort of issues do you think these candidates and especially the electorate is sorely missing out on being covered, which is crucial to New York City at this moment, you think?
I think housing issues always should get more coverage. Housing is so fundamental to the experience of being a New Yorker, and the cost of housing is such a tremendous challenge. So housing and tenant issues, clarifying where the candidates stand on tenant issues. I've tried to do some of that myself, but you can always want to see more of that. There hasn't been enough coverage of transportation either, of the state of the subways, of buses, of kind of what agenda they would advocate for in the state legislature, where non-New York City legislators have a lot of power over the MTA, which controls the city subways, and Cuomo ultimately controls the subways through his appointees to the MTA board. So transportation and housing always deserve more coverage, and I haven't seen it to the degree I think that would be helpful for the electorate.
A naive, optimistic part of me with some corroborating evidence maybe thinks that DSA and leftist organizing sat this race out because it's not as significant to gaining or consolidating power in the state. Else, why wouldn't a person such as Jumaane Williams not have entered the race, you think? And like another naive part of me also wonders that, like, you know, if AOC, Bowman, etc., are now supporting Wiley, then it should, like, especially since Wiley's campaign was likely in like life support before then, did that happen with any concessions? And what sort of power do you think the left can actually have in New York City going forward?
It's hard to say. I do think the left is growing in power, and it is maturing. I don't know what concessions, if any, Jamal Bowman and AOC demanded of Maya Wiley. It almost feels like because the other candidates crumbled away, you know, Bowman had been a Stringer supporter, this is what we're going to do. So I think they should have used their leverage to demand more, but it's not clear that they did that. And the question is to Jumaane Williams. You know, Jumaane Williams would have been a very strong candidate. He probably could have won. He was just elected public advocate. It seems like he wanted to keep his current job and not risk losing it. And there wasn't really a great push to force him into the race. And it didn't seem like he was interested at all. That I think has been an issue for the left because there hasn't been a very strong candidate to run and pick up that mantle. Jumaane could have been that. You know, he didn't want to do it. He may be waiting for the next mayoral race in 2029. He may want to do something else. So that's kind of an open question, but he didn't decide to run. Now, this is what we have, you know, a series of flawed candidates who may or may not be able to block Adams and Yang and then Garcia to an extent.